have the list. I'll accept. Okay, good. Let me pick up. Actually, this presentation and our panel is a little less like an orchestra, a little bit more like a jazz band, right? And so we're going to do some kind of spontaneous, I'd like to pick up on some of the riffs that my colleagues have already laid down and talk a little bit about, with a focus on some of the food system issues. But first, let me make a couple of points about the importance of cities here. In fact, if I can just make one overarching point in these brief comments, and they will be brief, I'm going to stick it to 5 minutes this time, is that cities are perhaps not the, but a key to both equity and mitigation, and that the metropolitan settlement system, the region, that surround primate cities, especially in North America, are the lock that cities need to unlock in order to achieve some of these equity goals, adaptation goals, and mitigation goals. And let me just very briefly use some graphical argument to substantiate that point, and then focus a little bit on some of the issues that my colleagues, my distinguished colleagues, have actually opened up for us for conversation. Let me, yeah, thank you. Appreciate that, Jim, David. So first, why do cities matter to climate mitigation? You can actually bring all of this up. Thank you. That's it. Good. Yep, that's all right. So if you'll look, I'm sorry, I'm absent my professorial pointer for this trip, but the image on the left shows CO2 equivalent emissions in the way they are usually presented. In fact, it's such a familiar graphic that we don't think about those emissions as being denominated, but in fact they are. These are emissions per acre. Right? And such an analysis, such a denomination, shows, rightly in this case, that cities, which is that red center in the region that I'm from, greater metropolitan Philadelphia, and the city of Philadelphia, surrounded by suburbs and exurbs out to the urban periphery. It actually begins to become rural at the very edge of that graphic. The red center there, as well as some traditional and originally agriculture supporting small towns around the metropolitan periphery, all of the red marks there do indeed generate large numbers of aggregate emissions. But what the figure on the right shows is, again, it's the same color scheme for both figures, but now CO2 equivalent emissions are denominated differently. They are now denominated in terms of population and employment. So take population plus employment, creating a kind of per capita measure, and you now see that in fact the lowest carbon profile, the lowest energy profile within the metropolitan settlement system is actually in the historic core, where the aggregate emissions, because of density, are greatest. This is, I think, for me certainly, this is kind of a fundamental diagram that points to why cities are so important for climate mitigation, regardless of which side of the picture you're looking at. They're the source of large aggregate emissions that have to be reduced, but they are also the low carbon locations which create the highest return on investment, the highest reward for investments in carbon mitigation. So next slide, please, Jim. Now, to take the reverse side of the question, why does climate mitigation, as this emerging dominant policy discussion, why does it matter so much for cities? And I am changing the scale here. I come from some time in a city government where my interests, frankly, the interests that I needed to represent were not global, they were very local. So, looking at it from this perspective, why does climate mitigation matter to cities? Again, a very quick kind of fundamental diagram that shows in this one region, but it is very typical of settlement patterns, certainly in North America. So we've gone in the last century, we have gone from high density out towards the metropolitan periphery, where land consumption grew at a rate over 7 times faster than population. Right? So we are consuming enormous amounts of land as the settlement spreads. Now, if you recall the first image, what we've done is we have built in a commitment in the settlement structure itself to the highest energy profile locations. Right? And what climate mitigation becomes is a rationale for reinvesting in the historic centers, not based on poverty, not based on politics, but based on the ability of those locations to return the greatest carbon mitigation. Now, what cities need to do, yes, thank you. What cities need to do in order to do that, let's just wrap it. In fact, we'll go so rapidly, I'll do it. What cities need to do in order to participate and contribute is build a capacity in order to achieve this. Philadelphia has actually been through an exercise that created its own sustainability plan, calibrating a set of very ambitious targets to the year 2015, the near-term horizon, so there was no possibility of fading it into the future, the commitments. And I want to talk just briefly, I'm giving you just a kind of a glimpse of what some of this is, talk briefly about our own food goals. We're the first major city in the United States to build, in the context of our overall sustainability plan, a set of commitments to local food access. We did this for a number of reasons. Probably the largest was the ability of land under agricultural use to absorb greater amounts of stormwater. Their water retention obviously goes up for land under cultivation as opposed to either, in the case of Philadelphia, derelict land. And that helped us meet our infrastructure goals, our infrastructure targets. But it also allowed us to pursue an equity target that was based on enhancing access to local food for both security and nutrition reasons. So that one of the 15 targets that we have in this very complicated framework that I will not get into now, one of our 15 stated targets by the year 2015 is to increase the number of Philadelphia residents who reside within a 10-minute walk of local food to 75%. It's kind of similar to Copenhagen's local goal regarding food, which is that they seek by the year 2017, I believe, to have 90% of the resident population within a 15-minute walk of local food. So it's a very similar kind of goal. The last point I want to make about this, and then I'll yield the microphone for our conversation. The last point I want to make about this is something that, again, other colleagues have already raised, which is that in addition to the individual techniques that are available regarding increasing this access and this local food production, it's very important to build, as Jim has already suggested, the infrastructure that can allow this local food system to achieve scale and to compete with other forms of production. Let me give you one example of our attempt to kind of take on this, actually two. One, we've established a food policy council based on some work in the Midwest, where the variety of interests can come together around a common table, the production, distribution of food, in order to set some food policy at the regional level. Again, building new organizational capacity. Second example, happy to follow up on any of this with Q&A. Second example is thinking about the delivery mechanism. Right now, one of the things that the existing food system has achieved is very low unit cost of, at least direct cost, of transportation. So we have a huge food distribution center in Philadelphia. Trucks, boats, distribution to markets, and so on. It's very difficult for truck farms or community gardens or community-supported agriculture to compete with the unit cost of that distribution system. So one of the things that we've established in Philadelphia is called the common market, which tries to aggregate some of these now fragmented producers and consumers, bring them together so that they can share and lower the cost of delivering this food into the urban system. It's one of many kinds of innovations that we're working on to try to make real some of these aspirations around increased access. So let me stop there and turn it back over to my colleague, JP.